Hey guys, the Mind Muscle Project is a podcast in Australia. Their two founders came out here. They did a podcast with Noah, Travis, and a bunch of our coaches. They've been really supportive to us over the years. I wrote the foreword to their training journal. A couple of our athletes and coaches are also featured in there. They did a bunch of podcasts that we wanted to put up on our YouTube page because Chris happened to be here and film them. So go check out their podcasts, subscribe to their iTunes, listen to their other episodes, and hopefully you enjoy the ones that we did here at TTTHQ.
We had some stuff that you guys wrote down before getting into it, but I did actually have a question to kick it off, Carl, about yourself and a follow-up from what we had yesterday. So yesterday we had Brandon and McGee talking about the teams.
Yep.
And I was curious where you sit now as coach and athlete with teams of 4.
I think I am an individual competitor. I think the more I have mulled this over and really given this a lot of thought, I think I just enjoy the individual aspects of competing. I like coaching individuals. I've always found the team competition, even when I was an athlete, when I was young, I found it to be challenging for me to work in that type of environment. I would get frustrated with myself. I would get frustrated with the team. And while I do enjoy it, I can enjoy it in casual settings. When it's something that's taken very seriously, I think for me, it's more of an individual aspect or an individual pursuit.
And what about as a coach?
Again, I really enjoy working with individuals and helping build people. I have coached teams. I spent a long time coaching swim teams. But I think that's where my strengths lie, is coaching individuals. It's just the way that my brain operates.
Right. Do you think you'll have a crack at Masters?
I would like to. I am currently on the path right now, as if in the 2020 season, as if I was going to try and compete as a Masters athlete.
How have you changed what you did when you were trying to qualify last time for regionals as an individual versus qualify for Masters? Because obviously there's no regionals for Masters.
Yeah, so the last time I was trying to qualify individually for regionals was 2016 and definitely fell short that year. So there's a lot of things that have changed. Just my life has changed dramatically. I've got another kid, moved states. I'm in like a completely different, training environment. So one of the things that's happened is I think I approach training very differently than I had then. Then it was a big part of my self-concept. Being an athlete was a huge part of who I was. And now to me, training is more just something that I love doing. And I have really, really tried to learn to love the things that I used to hate.
Right.
Part of my training philosophy now, and this came from, discussions with Max, reading books like The Obstacle is the Way, which is one of my favorite books that I've read recently. I've really been shifting the way I think about training from, I'm not good at handstand push-ups, to I'm going to do handstand push-ups as frequently as I possibly can because I'm not good at them, and eventually I'll learn to love them. So the things that tended to be obstacles for me in the past, I'm just attacking.
Did you find that how you've evolved with how you feel about your own training has affected what you've programmed for clients? Absolutely.
One of the things that's really changed is the way that I talk to competitive clients, right. and just about their training, where it used to be, I would try to figure out the things that they were weak at. Now I just try to get them to be honest and ask them, what are you struggling with? What are the things that you're afraid of? What are the things that you're apprehensive about? What are the things that you struggle with the most? And then I just program progressions for those things, and I give them to them frequently. And I found that tends to be a more successful strategy than me trying to make guesses about what those things might be.
Like guesses about their goals and what they want?
Yep. Just more communication and more direction from the athlete, where the athlete becomes the driver of the content of the program, and what I'm doing is just putting pen to paper.
How often will you find that an athlete will change their mind on a goal within the season based off results they're getting in training?
An athlete, someone who, and let's be clear, when I define an athlete, I'm talking about someone who is trying to compete the regional or above level. Their goal does not change. Those people have a very clear purpose, and they're out there with the intention of becoming a better athlete, becoming a better CrossFitter, and making it to whatever the next stage for them is. So when I'm talking about athlete, that's who I would define it as. I would say very little. Now, that doesn't mean that the target's not moving, right? So, someone might say when I give them, a list of movements and I have them go back through previous years, opens and regionals and games workouts, they might identify these 7 things, right? Rowing and handstand push-ups and all these things. And they say, this is what I'm weak at right now. And we might run training progressions for, 6 or 8 weeks. And then I send them that same list again, and I get a completely different set of movements that comes out. There might be some commonalities where rowing stays in there, but the other movements, they've gotten so much exposure to it, they're no longer unconfident in those movements, and we don't have to spend as much time dealing with those as we did in the past. So one thing to keep in mind is that while their big overarching goal hasn't changed, who they are as an athlete, their weaknesses, their strengths do change throughout the year. And so that's one of the things I think is important that I've learned as a coach, and also trying to take into my own training is like when I started out, really starting to ramp up training a little bit. Thrusters were something that were really weak, and I trained them hard for 6 or 8 weeks. Yeah. And they were easy in that final workout in the open. But then something like an overhead squat, which typically I'd considered a strength, just buried me in I guess that was week 4 or week 3. That absolutely buried me. And I was like, man, obviously my training needs to adapt to be able to address that. So just keeping in mind that the individual changes, but the outcome goal or whatever they want to become doesn't change.
Right. How do you have the conversation though when you feel like it's maybe not going to happen? Where obviously the regionals is getting more competitive each year. A guy like Travis who qualified in every other region, missed out in his own region. It's obviously extremely difficult to qualify. How many kicks of the can do you feel like some of your athletes have before you have to have a conversation with them? Like, what is it next? Or is it just like whatever the athlete says?
I think in general, my goal is to help athletes achieve whatever they want to achieve. But obviously, if they get to the point where they had so many repetitive injuries that it's just not a possibility, I'm going to be honest with them and ask them to take some time off or to really consider, changing their goal. But let's face it. I mean, I don't think that you would be doing a good job if you took an injured athlete and kept trying to train them for the CrossFit regionals or the CrossFit games. I just don't feel like you're doing a good job. But at the same time, telling someone that they need to give up all of their goals is also probably like you're not an answer then. You're not helping them find the answer. And so I think just having conversations with them is and being honest, like I don't think it's going to happen, but here are some resources that will help you get through whatever you're going through at this point. And if you're ready to attack the goal again at some point in the future when you are healthy and you are in a state where you can train, then I'm happy to be there. And I think if you're honest with people, they're more likely to respond positively to that than if you just let them keep rolling down the path.
I like how you said to me, and it was either this season or last season, you just said, you don't have to decide yet. Don't even make a decision about anything yet. Until you are certain about the decision, then you can make it as to whatever your goal is. And I think when you do that, it's like empowering for me or whoever the athlete is, because then there's like no time pressure to do what you want. Because everyone's like, oh, I've got 12 months till the next thing. But if you just like, oh, let's just make a decision when you feel ready, I feel like that is the best way to approach setting a new goal or wherever your training wants to be.
I've actually, talking about goals, that's something that I've been really exploring recently is just kind of, I think that the traditional goal setting is kind of, I don't want to call it broken, but I think there's a lot of problems with traditional goal setting. Like say an athlete comes on, they're like, man, I want to finish in the top 20 at regionals. Well, it's like an external thing. They're like, I want this thing that's external from me. And the reality is if they want to take a top 20 spot, they're going to have to do all the behaviors that are required in order to make it into a top 20 spot. And so instead of doing that, I ask people to picture themselves like, imagine yourself, you just finished regionals, you finished in the top 20. Now look back to now. What are all the steps that you took over the past year? What are all the obstacles that you overcame? What are the hurdles that we had to address? What are the behaviors? What are the habits that you developed? I was just talking to someone yesterday, and they have some breathing issues in training, like actual respiratory issues. And I was like, project yourself ahead to that goal, to that top 20 regional spot, and look back on the past season. Did you do respiratory training multiple times every week? I'm like, absolutely. There's no question that they have to do that stuff. But when you're sitting here and you're like, I want to be top 20, and you're just like, oh, that's the thing. The steps to get there are not very clear. So that's one of the ways that I've been trying to get people to think about it differently. I also have another one that kind of piggybacks on that. And that's, so many people talk about trying to enjoy the process. The process of becoming an elite athlete in a sport like CrossFit, which is a painful sport and one of the most demanding sports in the world, it's not really that enjoyable. You can find meaning in the suffering. You can find meaning in the process, but the process itself is not enjoyable. And so trying to enjoy something that is not enjoyable is a fool's errand. What you need to do is find meaning in the process. And I think if you can put that stuff into context, then people start to adapt to their training much more positively than if they're trying to find something positive out of something that is just challenging.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. What have you found some people transition into after they're done with the sport, but they stay with you as a coach? I don't know. Do you have many of those clients?
Yeah, I absolutely do. One of the things, just from a coaching perspective, one of the things that we tend to do with people like that, or what I tend to do, is I move them away from some of the performance training protocols that we've got. So they do less testers and less, if they were a CrossFit athlete, they do less like, Metcons and less stressful training structures. And they do stuff that tends to be things that they enjoy. And you have a conversation with the athlete the same way you do with an athlete who's trying to go to regionals or on the the upswing of their career. But you have that same conversation, like, what things do you enjoy? How do you define fitness? What do you like doing in the gym? What are the things that make it so that you want to keep coming back? And then you give them more of that. Because let's face it, at some point, if you're not trying to advance your career as an athlete, you should be able to enjoy the process, because training should be something that's enjoyable and not something that's imposing a stress on your life versus someone who's trying to actually like advance an athletic goal.
So hard for athletes to make that distinction, because training for so long has been like a job. It's been something you have to suffer through, and often it's not enjoyable, right? Probably the only enjoyable time is probably day one of your competition, when you're feeling fresh and you're like, finally, I'm getting to put all the work of training into this competition. And then obviously day 2 and 3, you wake up and you're just like, I hate my life. But
I think that would depend on how well you're going. Yeah. If you're winning, you always feel a lot better than you did if you're getting your face smashed in.
That's true. I
think there's a lot of emotion that gets tied up into losing. There's also a lot of emotion that gets tied up into winning, and the emotions of winning can really block some of the negative body somatic feelings that you get from pushing your body to the max.
Yeah,
you've done a good job. Speaking of someone who had an athletic career and athletic aspirations and has transitioned into something else, you've done a pretty good job at putting that into context. I mean, you're trying to get stronger right now, and you're getting stronger.
Yeah, I just thought about when I first started in the gym, because obviously when you first started in the gym, you love training. Like, you just love it. Even if you're doing the GVT, like German volume training, 10 by 10, like, you're still enjoying it. And it's because it's obviously so novel and it's so new. But I was like, what part of training did I enjoy the most? And like, why did I get started into training before CrossFit, even before that? And yeah, it just hit me. I was like, oh, well, it was like strength training and bodybuilding stuff and trying to get big. And I was like, screw it, I'm just going to do that and just not worry about my fitness so much, and I'll do some walks and do some classes with the group and whatever, and it's just more enjoyable. Like, I just enjoy training a lot more, and that is the place you need to be, I feel, for if you're going to keep it in your life for the rest of your life. Otherwise, I think we were talking about it yesterday with Tripp, is you're like an NFL athlete, and he's had tons of NFL athletes that he's trained, and because it was a job and they didn't learn how to integrate it into the rest of their life, they become obese. He's seen so many ex-NFL athletes become broke, obese, and injured, and it's just like, you don't want to end up like that.
The same is true for the guys I swam with in college. It was a job. It was something that they learned to hate because it was so stressful and demanding and painful that when they were done, they well, they didn't have any other, they didn't know a lot about other realms of fitness. They didn't know about strength training. They didn't find CrossFit early on and things like that. So, they end up going down this path where they're still eating like they were swimming, 5,000-6,000 calories a day, and they're not training anymore. They're not training, 5 hours a day to deal with that. And so they quickly, their health deteriorates quickly. Definitely something we've seen. But to your point about, you said you think back to, why did you start? I think that's probably something that would work for the majority of people. But if I think about my life, the reason I started training in the first place is so vastly different than why I train now.
Right.
I don't know if it's because I'm so much older now than I was. I mean, that was half my life ago when I started to train, more than half my lifetime ago when I started to take my training seriously. And I've gone through so many, versions of myself in that span of time that the reason that I train now is so different than when I trained when I was 14, because I was 14.
Wow, you guys get started way earlier than us. Yeah, it's crazy. We saw there was a kid yesterday. How old was he? Maybe 15. He didn't have his license. When did you get your license?
He was 15 years old.
16.
Okay, he was 15, and he's getting scouted for
Football.
high schools and colleges or something in the future, and it's just like blowing up his ego. And there's no way. Did you know anyone that was getting scouted at 15 or 16?
It doesn't exist in Australia.
Yeah, it's just it's a totally different level.
That's definitely a reality in the States.
Yeah, that is crazy. It just makes sense how people can get so strong so early on, because a lot of Australia is notorious for being one of the weaker regions, really, and
Australia and Europe generally.
Yeah,
they're considered the engine regions that are weaker.
Yeah, because we play a lot of running sports, but not a lot of power and strength sports. So it's it's interesting. I would like to see someone take on a crop of athletes from the best schools in Australia. I don't know how they do it, maybe in Sydney, and train them from a very, very early age, like a proper strength and conditioning program.
In what sport? Or just GPP?
Yeah, in general. See how strong they could really get. And it's making me think, is it just the years and years, the generations of just good genetics, just layering into other good genetics in America? And so strong athletes are kind of being bred into strong athletes for so many generations. Yeah.
I absolutely think it's cultural.
Yeah.
The sports, you guys have more anaerobic sports though. We don't really have many football. Rugby is a lot more aerobic, and you're running a lot more. AFL, you run 15 Ks a game. Well,
I know we've talked about this before. You guys dominate Olympic sport. A lot of the endurance-based Olympic sports. Australia swimming, perennially has been dominant. Yeah. Triathlon has been huge.
The walking.
Power
walking.
We're good at walking.
Good at walking. Yeah.
I'll take you on later.
Yeah. And then not many sports outside of that really at the Olympic level. I mean,
we won 14 golds. And we won 14 golds, and not a single gold was outside the water.
Yeah. We had one Olympics.
Makes sense. You guys are a gigantic island.
Pretty good rowing though, no?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really good at rowing.
Yeah. Another endurance sport. Yeah. We had decent cycling for a while. Also an endurance sport. What's it called? The velodrome. The circle one? Yep. Yeah, that was pretty good.
Do you think your weightlifting is going to be improving just because of the influence of CrossFit on weightlifting?
Probably not.
No, I can't say it.
Not really.
No?
Nah, I think Tia's a bit of an exception.
That's kind of who I was thinking.
Yeah. There are some male athletes that put up some pretty good numbers in terms of the Commonwealth level, but then you compare them to China and Russia and Bulgaria and stuff, and it's it's incomparable, really. So, I don't know. We'll have to see. I mean, to be fair, those doping programs are far superior to Australia's doping programs.
We've got one of the worst doping programs, I'd say.
It's not sponsored by the state at all. It's underground. There's no government money, unfortunately.
In fact, the governments, at least in the States, and I'm sure it's the same for you guys, are probably trying to prevent a lot of that from happening. So
absolutely,
they're putting money into prevention versus money into actually encouraging. So.
I don't think we've ever got any coach's opinion on. We've got a lot of athletes' opinions on what happened last season with Ricky. So, Carl or Evan, what's your opinion on, or maybe both your opinions as to what played out with the when Ricky got caught?
Evan?
I mean, I don't know what angle you want me to tackle this from, but I think at any point, if you lead someone to believe that the most important thing in the world is lifting a barbell or like doing wall balls, or like if you look at cycling, the most important thing in the world is riding a bicycle fast. Well, if you put that in front of someone and you make that their world, and they have the option of using those substances, you're almost incentivizing them to use it. So I think in a lot of cases, if you're looking at it from the athlete perspective, and that is their entire life and everything's riding on that, and that's available to them, why wouldn't they use it? Not saying it's okay, or I'm not saying it's moral, but if you're looking at it from that perspective, you could start to understand the psychology of why that happens.
And I don't know if you guys have met Ricky, but
I have not.
I haven't personally met him.
But his life is absolutely very centered around it. They're in a part of Australia where there's not a lot else going on outside of like farming and training. Absolutely, you can understand it, right? And he saw his brother's success as well, so he thought, it's in his genetics. He can make this happen. It's all the things stacked against him. Did you watch the documentary?
I did, yeah.
And so what did you think of how CrossFit decided to portray the events?
I think it's always a little bit polarized. Like, I think watching the video did seem like a little bit of a setup. They knew that he had been busted at that point, and they're kind of leading him to kind of like hang himself in the video. So I don't know if that's necessarily like a moral thing, like fighting like, oh, this guy cheated, so we're going to make him look even worse to try and like create a straw man there. But I think ultimately, like, there's two sides of every argument. Yes, he was in the wrong. He broke the rules of the sport, and honestly, he deserved what he got. Like, hands down, he cheated. Undeniable. But I think there has to be, like, more education around that. Like, the testing needs to be better. Everything about that entire subsection of the sport, I think, needs to be handled more professionally and just done at, like, a more strict and stringent level. Because even the testing, you look at who got tested, how they structured that, it is pretty inconsistent.
What do you reckon, Carl? How'd you feel about it?
I don't have a lot of thoughts on it. I didn't follow a lot of that closely. When I heard, I said, "Oh, I'm not that surprised that there's athletes in this sport that are doping." It's not like a surprising fact, knowing how rampant doping is in sport in general, and the fact that there's more and more and more money involved in the sport. It's not that surprising. One of the things that did surprise me was actually his drug of choice, and the fact that he thought it was something that listening to some of the things that he said, I passed my drug test at regionals while I was taking it, or something along those lines.
That's what he said.
And I got popped at the games. It just seemed odd to me. Like, I'm not sure why that would be a drug of choice for him in a sport like CrossFit, and why he wouldn't have popped at regionals and why he did at the games.
I think the reason that he wouldn't have gotten popped at regionals, he was taking a SARM, correct?
Yeah.
Was it?
No.
I thought he was taking like an LGD or like an Austrian.
No, it was GW 15.6
so
or
peptide hormone.
No, it's not a peptide. It's an what they call like an exercise mimetic. It basically increases mitochondrial biogenesis.
Okay.
That's why I'm so confused, because when I think about CrossFit, the limiter is so rarely for a high level athlete. It's so rarely at the level of the muscle tissue. It's so much more oxygen delivery and oxygen transport.
I was going to say, with something like that, you could even make the argument that would be ergolytic, and it would actually make you worse at the sport.
Oh my God, could have won the games.
That's kind of where I was going.
Yeah.
Like, that would be a great thing for someone to take if they were like untrained and trying to build capacity, or if you're trying to burn body fat. But the mechanism of that particular drug is just stupid. And I say stupid, it's stupid for this sport.
Yeah, because if you look at the demands of the sport, most elite athletes in CrossFit, their limitation is either their heart's ability to get blood and oxygen into the muscle, or their ability to get O2 into the blood. A drug like that is going to make it so you use oxygen quicker in the muscle. Well, if you look at it logically, you're just creating a greater oxygen demand in the muscle, and if you're not increasing the supply, you're just creating a deficit quicker. So actually, like, piggybacking on that, I have no idea why anyone would take that for this sport.
What sport would it be good for then?
Short power-based sports. If you're doing like an 100-meter sprint, even up to 200, something really under 20 to 30 seconds, that would be really good.
And honestly, I would imagine it being more beneficial for non-athletes, for people that are just, weekend warrior type people. But let's be completely honest. If you look at what's out there about the drug he took, it's the only drug that the World Anti-Doping Association has ever made a statement about the fact that it has actual health consequences. It has very clearly demonstrated that it can cause cancer in basically every animal model that they've ever tested it on. And the reason that it's not an actual prescription drug is because when it was in either phase 1 or 2 trials, they had a whole host of adverse events. An adverse event is basically like the scientific and clinical community's way of saying this drug fucked people up.
Oh, shit.
So that's the only one that the World Anti-Doping Association has been like, hey, we know you guys are going to dope, but if you're going to, don't take this one because of the health consequences.
Right.
So,
But I think if you look at it that way, like there's even a research study, I think it was like 8 or 9 years ago, where they surveyed Olympic athletes anonymously from tons of countries, and they said if you could take a pill that made it that you absolutely will win an Olympic gold, but it will take 30 years off your life, I think it was like 80% of them said that they would do it. So I think in that case, if an athlete really believes that that's going to help them, they might not have like the wherewithal or the foresight to be like, oh yeah, maybe I'll get cancer, but they're putting this winning streak on such a high pedestal that maybe that's worth it to them.
I still just find the fact that that drug choice is just shows how ill-informed that poor young man was.
Yeah, and I think you see that across the board. Like most of the drugs that you see athletes get popped with in CrossFit, you look at them and you're like, what the fuck are you thinking? Like half of them have no studies longer than like a 3 to 5 year term. Most of them show pretty like crazy side effects. And you're like, yeah, definitely I would not advocate taking any of that shit because it's banned and you know that you're committing a crime, and like just morally I don't think it's necessarily the right thing to do.
And that ignores all of the health factors.
And that ignores all the health factors.
Right.
So it's like if you are going to break the rules of the sport, potentially commit a crime in your country, like morally sink down to that level, well, you'd think through it enough to actually look at something and be like, well, what is not going to fuck me up for the rest of my life, and not take that. And most of the athletes, the fact that they're not even thinking that through, it leads me to believe that a lot of these choices with the athletes that get popped, they're really just not thinking through the consequences, period.
Yep.
Health, morals, like sport-wise, long-term career, longevity.
I feel like they get so trapped in their own sort of like tiny bubble, their own little self-concept, that it becomes almost a reinforcing, like they can't get out of this groove of thinking that the only way that they're going to be successful is by taking this drug, which may not even actually be helping them, as we've already established. But they're just so stuck in that mindset that they can't get themselves out of it. And it takes, thankfully, probably for Ricky, thankfully it took HQ popping him to get him off of it. And hopefully he's made some better health choices, even, leaving the moral and ethical and cheating aspect out of it. Hopefully he's just making better health choices for himself as a result of that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say he is for certain. I don't know if he's off it either. But anyway, that's for him to worry about.
It does seem like pretty much everyone we've spoken to, like he would have got the same results he got regardless of whether he was taking it.
Yeah.
Unless there was something else, like, he didn't get caught for. But it seems like it probably didn't really help him.
Yep,
Taking
I'd say that's probably most accurate.
There was actually a study that one of our mates was telling us about. He's a scientist dude. And
hang on.
What does
a scientist do?
It's a guy that is not quite a scientist yet because he's a post-grad.
Yeah.
And he's a dude. Like, he's a bro.
Oh,
so
he's a bro.
he knows about it.
Yeah, gotcha.
So
good combo.
Yeah, so he knows about this stuff and he's interested in it. And he was telling us about a study that they were using testosterone, injecting testosterone into people, and they were using real testosterone, a placebo, and then I think they were using some other, maybe growth hormone or something. Anyway, the group that was being told that they were being injected testosterone was the placebo, and the group that was told they were getting a placebo actually were getting testosterone. And so one group was getting testosterone were told they weren't getting anything.
Right.
One group was getting a placebo, told they were getting testosterone. They did like an 8-week lifting program or something like that, and then they retest at the end. And the group that was told that they were getting testosterone but were getting a placebo got better results than the group that were told they were getting a placebo.
This is common in all drug trials. The placebo effect is actually a pretty massive effect. I was actually just listening to a podcast, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was this group of doctors, I think from Canada, and what they do is they analyze the evidence for different for different drugs. And I think the particular one that I was listening to, they were looking at CBD and THC in particular, and they were looking at all of the trials that have been done up to this point on the actual medical benefits. And the reality is it was only marginally better than placebo, but anything that is consistently marginally better than placebo tends to actually be something that is effective. So my takeaway, I think they said it was around 33% improvement for placebo on just like a global average for clinical drug trials, period.
Oh, wow.
And I think to
That's
take
crazy.
that even further, I remember when I was at the university, they were doing studies on the placebo, and they were calling it like nocebo trials, where they were telling people that we are giving you a placebo. So to literally tell you, like, we are giving you nothing, but we're telling, like, this pill cures, like, heart disease, but this is a fake pill, so it's not actually going to do anything, and they still got the positive benefits, even though they were saying, we're studying this drug and what it does, but we're not actually giving it to you. We're letting you know that, and the people would still get benefits. So you're like, well...
Because they believed that they might actually have been lied to.
And
yeah, maybe.
Circling that background to the whole testosterone thing, too, it's like if you actually look at the more contemporary research on that subject, what it's actually looking like is it's really not that important for what we think it does. And, like, testosterone is not the, like, master hormone for, like, anabolism or hypertrophy that we thought it was.
So what is? Because there are guys out there who are obviously getting swole as
Yeah,
fuck.
I mean...
Well, let's look at it this way. There are women that are building tons of muscle mass without using drugs. And if you look at testosterone levels of the average woman, they're so far below even hypogonadal or low test men, that the men that are like, oh, I can't build muscle mass, and it's like, well, this lady has a quarter or an eighth of the testosterone that you do, and she's building muscle mass. Well, obviously, it's not the master hormone. It might be a factor, but it's not the master hormone.
Yeah, certainly a factor, and obviously, if you're taking it at super physiological levels where you're like doubling, tripling what someone would normally have in their body, you're certainly going to have an effect just because it's in such a high dosage. But if you really like start digging into biochemistry and the research, and you realize how many like feedback loops there are in like circles that are overlapping with each other, there's so many other pieces that are at play that it really doesn't take as big of a role, because if you are taking testosterone super physiologically, your body has feedback mechanisms to self-correct that anyway. So a lot of it...
For example, decreasing androgen receptor density. So you got to think about testosterone like a lock and a key, right? So the androgen receptor is like the lock, and testosterone is like the key, right? And you have to have both of those things present for testosterone to have its impact. Well, if you take like when he says super physiological, it means above normal test levels. If you go above that, then your body decreases the number of androgen receptors that are in the muscle, the muscle cell surface, so you get less of an impact from getting all that extra testosterone. Now, I'm not saying that taking super physiological doses of testosterone will not result in anabolism, muscle growth, and strength increases. It's just going to decrease your sensitivity to testosterone. And the longer you do it, the more you decrease that sensitivity, which is one of the reasons why when people come off test, they lose muscle mass so quickly.
Right. Yeah, is it true that the androgen receptor sites, like, they are most dense in the shoulders and the traps?
Yeah, like delts, upper traps, and upper back,
Yeah.
There's also multiple types of androgen receptors.
And one of the reasons for those specifically, there's called like myonuclei. It's like how many nucleuses the muscle cell has.
Yep.
So one of the effects where, like Kyle was saying, you lose a lot of the gains when you come off, but there are certain effects that last for the rest of your life. So once you basically create more nucleuses in the muscle cell, you're going to have those for the rest of your life. The fact that the traps, delts, shoulders are all so dense with those, that's one of the reasons why, when people get on those drugs, their shoulder girdle, you usually see a lot of changes there, and a lot of that, those morphological changes last for the rest of their life.
Right.
So you gain more muscle in your upper traps. Like those, like,
proportionately, yeah. Like you have more.
I can see Ruth
receptor
thinking,
sites.
this is what I'm going to do.
He's got the delts.
I was going to say, he already has the delts.
Yeah.
And it's on sale here.
He's like, how do I get these?
It's on sale. Oh, man. That would be why, like, so many people that gear up really hard and then they get off it, but then they find CrossFit later in life or whatever. They are so good at strict handstand push-ups.
They're good at strict handstand push-ups, but they have the worst cardiac limitation that you could possibly imagine.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm not going to say it always does, but can accompany really high doses of testosterone is cardiac scarring. It creates all kinds of issues with heart tissue over the long term, and that in and of itself may preclude people who go on big test cycles from ever performing extremely well. I'm not saying that they're not going to perform well across it, but in a sport that requires massive cardiac output, if you have cardiac scarring, your cardiac output is limited and you're going to have problems.
Cardiac scarring is like damaged heart tissue, basically.
Correct.
So it's not functioning optimally.
Correct.
Right.
It doesn't mean it's not functioning, it's just not functioning optimally.
Yeah. And if you're going to win the games, it needs to be as optimized as possible.
It needs to have as much extensibility, which basically means the heart needs to be able to expand as freely as possible.
Let in as much blood as possible, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Instead, you also get on the right portion of your heart, like the right ventricle will just get thicker and like really bound up.
Right. Yeah. That's I can't remember, maybe it was Eddie Hall talking about it or whatever. That is the most common issue that the big powerlifter guys take, is not necessarily the drug itself, but the effect of having so much strain on the heart, of so much muscle mass, that is the highest risk for them, is the heart attack.
That doesn't even actually have to be caused by test. Like that can just be caused
from
by
being too big.
Strength training, bodybuilding, things like that, where you are getting. It doesn't even necessarily have to be the size of the muscle mass. It's the stiffness of the muscle mass, like tension that's carried in the muscle mass that increases the blood pressure. And the higher the blood pressure is, the more resistance your heart is pushing against with each of those pumps.
Yeah, I was going to say, when I, like a few years ago, I had some talks with some of the like contemporary Russian sports scientists that were also involved in the athletic programs in like the 70s and 80s. And they could do a lot of research here that we just can't legally do, but one of the things that they had talked about is around the 70s or 80s, a lot of the Olympic hockey players had died from heart attacks, and when they actually did autopsies on their bodies, they found that all of them, in like their literature, they call it like bull heart. It's basically like the right side of their heart like looks like a bull's heart. It's like enlarged, like super stiff.
Oh, wow.
And they talked about even some of their like middle distance runners, just from the volumes of anaerobic work that they were doing, had such bad cardiac scarring that they couldn't do like anaerobic training or hard energy system training for even 20-30 years for risk of heart attack.
Shit. Do you think that's a risk for CrossFit athletes? Modern day CrossFit athletes trying to make it to regionals?
That's a tough thing to say. I would say that for an older population who were deconditioned before coming into CrossFit, of course it's a possibility, but let's face it, the alternative, which is being sedentary, is far more dangerous.
Of course.
So I would say that from a risk-reward perspective, that the reward of a sport like of starting a sport like CrossFit later in life is far outweighs the risks. I think there's no question about that.
Yeah, and I think in those cases too, like most athletes have some degree of common sense. Like if they're completely like driven into an overtraining state, they're not going to keep pushing. You have to take into account those athletes were also using a lot of drugs. So even though they were pushing their bodies,
when he says those athletes, you are
the Russians,
back to the
Russians,
just to be 100% clear.
Yeah. I made that connection, but
yeah,
maybe
the
not
Russian
everyone
athletes, they were using a lot of drugs. So despite the fact that their hearts were in these extreme overtraining states and not recovering, a normal person wouldn't be able to keep pushing through that.
Right.
But if you're layering in all these like exogenous or substances from outside of your body, that's going to allow you to keep pushing past the point where any normal person's body is going to keep functioning.
Right.
So they could get to that point where, like, I mean, if we tried to do that to ourselves intentionally, we would probably never be able to get there.
The other beauty of CrossFit itself, and I don't know if it's necessarily CrossFit, but the demands of CrossFit as a sport is that it requires a combination of strength, endurance, flexibility, all these really diverse training qualities. And by requiring development and all these different training qualities, I think that you may prevent some of the cardiac issues that you see in power lifters, bodybuilders, and that athlete population. Not that all of them end up with cardiac issues. By all means, most of them will not. But
Right.
I don't think that you're going to see the same degree of cardiac issues that you would in those athletes, just because of the endurance and honestly, like, movement and mobility requirements for this sport.
If we stay on like bodybuilding, powerlifting sort of thing, there's always like little phases that come and go, like, that are popular. One in particular is functional bodybuilding, which is essentially just now a brand of Marcus Filly, but a lot of people have become interested in bodybuilding, but also not being the bodybuilder that's super stiff and can't jump and can't move well, right?
Basically, just looking like Marcus Filly. A lot of people are interested in now.
Basically, yeah. What advice would you have to people if they want to do bodybuilding but stay, athletic in terms of, they still want to Olympic lift, they still want to be strong, they still want to maybe do muscle ups and that sort of thing, do some gymnastics movements. What principles or like what exercise prescriptions, that sort of thing, should they?
Evan, you want to?
Yeah, I'd say to start, just looking at the body like a full structural unit. Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at the body just like a set of muscle insertions, and you're training in a way that is conducive to that, like, I'm only going to do bicep work right now in this linear plane, yeah, you're going to shorten the muscles and you're going to use range of motion. But there's actually a coach coming from Australia. Are you familiar with Eugene Teo?
Yep.
So,
Yeah. Super interesting guy.
Yeah,
Massive calves.
Oh my God, that dude's calves are tremendous.
Out of control. Yeah.
But
we'll get him on, Raf. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, so if you look at a guy like that and what he's doing in the bodybuilding space, and he's someone that you look at, like, I know we talk about a lot of the fascial theory and Thomas Myers' work and applied to CrossFit athletes. He's one of the only people that I've seen really apply all of those functional medicine principles and like fascial principles to bodybuilding. And incorporating those at some of my athletes, I've even seen they're able to put on a good bit of muscle without losing range of motion because they're looking at their bodies as a whole unit. If you really start getting into like embryology and anatomy and seeing how muscles function, yeah, most of them aren't meant to contract in these linear planes. So if you actually incorporate the like function of the muscle into a movement, you could hypertrophy it without losing those ranges of motion. Like if you just look at something simple like the pec, most people when they're training it, just pressing straight back and forth, shortening it in that range. Well, that's not what the pec's meant to do. So of course you're going to lose range of motion. If you were to take like the function of it, keeping your hands completely supinated here and pressing across the body and internally rotating simultaneously, that's the function of the pec. So if you look at all of the muscles and tie them together in that way, you do mitigate a lot of those negative effects that you would get with traditional bodybuilding programs.
Well, so what was the fascial stuff? You said it like we all knew it, but I have no idea what you're talking about.
So to give you an idea, kind of like a simple way to sum it up. So a lot of times we look at our body and we say like, oh, we have like 600 muscles or whatever it is. And the reality is that's not true. We really just have one muscle and we have like 600 insertion points for that muscle. Okay. So if that's the case, one of the ways to look at the body, classically people look at the body, you could use an analogy of like just like a house or a building warehouse like we're in right now. Mm-hmm. Let's say you pile up a bunch of snow on the corner of the roof of that warehouse, that corner is going to collapse, but the rest of the structure stays intact. Mm-hmm. That's not how our bodies actually are. Our bodies are one like continuous structure. Our bodies are more like a card castle instead of an actual house. If you flick out one corner of the card castle, the entire structure collapses. So if you look at our body in that light, you could see how an issue in our left knee might impact our right shoulder and things of that nature. Right. And if you start to incorporate that into your exercise selection and how you program, then you could start to mitigate those like negative effects that you'd get when you really do just look at your body like a group of muscles. I have my bicep day and I have my like quad day, and a lot of even classical bodybuilding splits you look at, they have like back and bicep day. Well, if you were really looking at the body like a whole unit, that doesn't really make sense. What would make more sense is like back and triceps, because those are actually agonists to one another, or pairing like hip flexor work with chest work, which no one would really do, because from a bodybuilding split, you'd be like, well, I'd pair chest with triceps. But if you look at the body like an entire unit, well, the hip flexors and the psoas connect the opposite part of the thoracolumbar junction is the pecs. So if you pair those together, you're actually mitigating the effects of like having tight pecs or tight hip flexors.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. What were you going to jump in and say?
I was going to take a simpler route than that. And what I was going to say is your question was, to the people who want to continue to be able to do Olympic weightlifting and pull-ups and retain range of motion while still, say they're not competing in a sport and they want to move into bodybuilding. My suggestions from some basic principle standpoints would be keep your variance high. Movement variance is an absolute key. Keep your loading variance high. Rotate your training split so that you're not always doing squats on Monday, bodybuilding on Tuesday, that there's actually some rotation throughout the course of the week, even an A and a B split. So you have an A week where squatting is on Monday, and on your B week, hinging and deadlifting is on Monday, and it just rotates back and forth. Creating simple ways to create variance within your training can, number one, it can potentially keep people healthier, but number two, it keeps you exposed to a much wider variety of movement patterns. And our bodies are going to adapt to exactly the movements that we require it to move through on a daily basis. So I would say that's a simple version of what Evan laid out there.
The loading variance, that would be like the rep ranges and set ranges.
Yeah, if you look at any literature on strength training, and what they call an undulating periodization is always more successful than a linear periodization. And I think at this point, every well-done peer-reviewed study that I've ever seen in undulating periodization, which is basically just a rotation or variance of rep ranges. That's not necessarily the best way to get someone strong in one movement for like a single rep, but it is a great way to get people generally strong and strong through the different strength qualities, from absolute strength to strength endurance to speed strength. That is a very effective way to achieve that. And when you say someone that's no longer competing in a sport that wants to retain their ability to do multiple different things, that's what I think of. Someone that has strength through all of the strength qualities. That's not going to be optimal for a power lifter who needs to peak for one rep.
Yeah, of course.
Right? But it would be very successful for someone who's trying to retain their ability to branch out in many different directions.
So is that using like reps 1 all the way through to 30 kind of all the time with your program?
Yep.
Yeah,
blended together in some way. And obviously it's not random. I think another principle to keep in mind there would be the principle of polarization, where if you're doing low rep singles and doubles, then you pair that with higher rep work. It's not optimal for peaking an athlete. Like I said, this is not a way that you're going to prepare an athlete for CrossFit or prepare an athlete for a powerlifting event. But it's great for people from a general health perspective. Evan, you look like you had something you wanted to add.
pretty much hit what I was going to.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so you had some stuff written down, Ev, about principles or training principles, older ones that people are maybe, applying to the sport of CrossFit that aren't really working?
Yeah, and I think what we were actually just talking about, actually transitions to this pretty well, because we were talking about like classic bodybuilding splits that people would always use versus what people might be doing now that work a little bit better, like periodization concepts that people used to use that might not be the best thing. So I think that transitions well into what we wanted to talk about, which is classical periodization models and training models that people still use, and science that they use to justify those principles that are just really out of date. To give you an example, like I don't know how many training books you've read in the past like 10 years, but every single one usually starts with the same generic kind of introduction science section. They talk about supercompensation theory and the SAID principle and all of these things that were taken from stress physiology. And that's the justification for all of these training models and all these books that you read.
Right.
So the basic model is you apply a stress, the stress breaks them down to some degree, then they supercompensate. That's the basic model that they all use. And then there's the SAID principle, which is specific adaptations to imposed demands. Basically, that if you do bench press, you're going to adapt to get stronger in bench press, as an example.
Yep.
Yeah. But if you look at the field of stress physiology, where they took those principles from classically, stress physiologists no longer even agree with those. They're like, yeah, we don't believe that that's true anymore. And they've completely thrown out those principles, yet people are still taking from that old stress physiology literature and using that as their justification. So it's something that at the time when training scientists used those principles, it made sense.
Right.
Because that's the best they could do. And we could talk about it a little bit more if you want, under the circumstances that they invented those. But that no longer makes sense, and people are still doing that.
So what's the new model, Evan?
So the new model that I'd use, well, we could even just talk about what's wrong with the old model first, or even why that's not necessarily correct. So
Is this like, are you saying that there are like coaches and group programs and stuff out there that are using these principles?
yeah, I mean,
This is almost
this
this
is-
is training science or training
General.
theory in general.
Right.
Yeah, I think even just looking at the field of exercise physiology, if you're even studying that at a university right now, the things that they're teaching you are just not accurate. They're still using the same principles in textbooks that were taught, even a book like Super Training, where the science section in there, a lot of it has been completely debunked, and people still cite that as like the end-all, be-all book of training knowledge. Meanwhile, the scientists from those fields that they're pulling studies from in that book wouldn't even agree with those principles anymore.
Shit, we got issues.
Yeah.
So what are some of these big issues?
Super training is like a Bible, though. If you like
Yeah,
listen to any podcast, like the last 15 years, they're like, yeah, dude, any books? Super training.
But
Never
mine-
actually read it, but
It's
Well,
definitely
that's what I was
something
saying.
that
No one even reads Super
No one
Training.
reads it.
Like, if you read it, you're
Whoa,
like,
whoa,
this
whoa.
science.
I've read
Yeah,
Super
I mean,
Training.
I've read it too, but I don't.
I've read Super Training. If your goal is to be a coach in the sport, one of the things that you should do is go back and learn from people from before you. But you also have to understand that our understanding of training is evolving constantly. We never will have all of the answers. It's not something training theory, just like any branch of knowledge, is not something that's static. It's dynamic. It changes constantly. So if you need to go back and understand those basic concepts, and then you need to build on those concepts.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what Evan's getting
And I
at.
think
Yeah.
piggybacking on that, like, look at where those concepts even came from to try and understand them. Like, what I kind of analogize a lot of those initial concepts to is like the QWERTY keyboard that we all use.
Okay.
Like, are you familiar with like the history of why our keyboard's even laid out like this?
No, but I actually have read it, but I can't remember.
Yeah, so the reason why we used to have like mechanical keyboards and
Yeah.
the keys would jam if you typed too fast.
Yeah.
So they figured out what is the least efficient way you could possibly lay out a keyboard, and that's the QWERTY keyboard that we use. It's the slowest way that you could type.
And,
Right.
and now
And
we
that-
can type faster with our thumbs than people
Exactly.
could with an alphabet.
So we don't even have mechanical keyboards anymore. They're all digital. Yeah, like a typewriter.
Yeah.
We don't even have mechanical keyboards anymore, yet we all still use this, even though it's like the worst laid out thing. And super training's kind of the same thing. At the time when they invented those theories, they made a lot of sense for the problems they were facing. Specifically, if you look back in the really old, like, Soviet research, when they invented block periodization, all these concepts, one of the things they kept noticing is in the winter, their athletes performed like absolute dog shit year in and year out. They're like, well, we need to figure out some kind of system to make this work. So they figured out block periodization. Years later, they
wait, is that because it's so cold in Russia?
exactly. They discovered that.
Why are they doing so poorly?
the sun was not strong enough
So
to
years
to warm them
later,
up.
they started using UV lamps in all their training halls, and they completely threw out that block periodization model, and they stopped using it. But
it was-
the books were already
Yeah.
written,
That
and
is
everyone
crazy.
else started
And-
doing it.
And to keep in mind
Oh, man.
that the block periodization model was an upgrade to the models that existed at the time.
Exactly.
So when everyone took that information and started applying it in sport worldwide, it was more successful than what they had been doing. But that doesn't mean that it's the most successful way to train
also,
people.
block
Continue.
periodization was an update of the periodization model that they were using prior.
Circle
which-
periodization?
Prior
Triangle.
to
Prior-
block.
prior to block periodization, the model that they were using wasn't even based on biology. It actually came from a social planning and like communist manifesto type principle, and that's what they were using to plan their training and base it off of. It was very philosophically driven.
Oh, wow.
And then the update was block periodization, and then block periodization morphed into what people are using now in updated versions. But if you follow the whole history, there's really no good biology or science proving that that actually works. And they kind of took these post hoc principles and like, oh, supercompensation said principle, this is why we do it. But it was a justification after the fact. That's
Yeah.
not really why
Right.
they did it.
It was basically they looked at the way that people adapted and tried to retrofit their block model onto that. And what we know now is that the block model does not accurately predict the way that people adapt to physical training and things like that. And Evan, I'm sure you'll jump in on this, it's block periodization looked for the most part at the athlete as almost a machine where you put a training input in and you expected a given output on this timeline, right? That's how the periodization worked. We know that that's not the case because we know that training doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? People have stress inputs from their life, from food, from the environment. They have social stress, biological stress. I mean, the way that we adapt to training is so multifaceted that to think that we could come up with a linear block plan that predicts the way that an individual will adapt, I think is almost egotistical as coaches, and definitely not accurate.
So is block, just quickly, is block like doing hypertrophy and then doing strength?
Yeah, and then moving into strength work and then moving into like peaking work.
Just like 2 months at a time.
Yeah, or like in endurance sports, they used to do is like you have your 5 months of doing aerobic base work, and now you're doing your high intensity work, and now you're doing your peaking work. I've used that with athletes in the past. It doesn't fucking work. Like, you might get some residual gains because you're working hard, but if you really pay attention to what like the best coaches in specific sports are doing and really try and model it, you could understand why that doesn't work, because that's just not how our bodies work.
Let's be clear. Evan says it doesn't work. It does work. It does create the desired adaptation of improving someone in the sport versus where they were before, but it's not the optimal way to improve someone in the sport.
Yeah, and I think that piggybacks on that's just not how... Whoa.
We're good.
Are we good?
Yeah.
Good save.
That's why we can't have nice things. So, that's where I think, like, looking at actual biology, and I think, like, 2 years ago or so when I was here, I started reading, like, a bunch of books from random fields, and one of the ones that I read was this book on, like, environmental biology, which was just really fucking random. I don't even really like that topic that much. But I started reading it, and everything in there, it was basically about the environment and how it kind of self-corrects itself, and I started looking into more of that literature and physiology in different fields, and I realized the same principles really do apply to our bodies. Like in that book, they were talking about how in nature, like everything must go somewhere. Like if something happens here, then it's going to have a chain reaction here, or like there's no such thing as a free lunch in nature.
Yeah, like the concept of the butterfly flaps its wings and
exactly,
and, the typhoon happens every year, right?
When we started talking about that and doing more research and getting more like contemporary models of adaptation, not from the field of exercise physiology, from other fields that were on the cutting edge there, like molecular bio, you could kind of even come up with a bullet-pointed list of why those supercompensation models don't really make sense, and then you could start to form an alternative of what works better. And again, like Kyle said, I definitely talking a little bit more extremes where I'm like, it doesn't work. That's obviously an extreme example because back in the 1950s, Roger Bannister ran a sub 4-minute mile by going on walks like 3 days a week.
Yeah.
So anything works to an extent, but I really don't think that's the best way to do things. And if we're trying to develop athletes to the highest level, well, why are we going to waste our time and energy on things that don't directly bring us closer to the goal? We want to be surgical because ultimately we want to do as little work as possible to get there, not have an athlete train 30 hours a week when maybe 15 of those training hours were actually relevant to what they need to be doing.
So that's interesting because we see a lot of athletes do way too much training. And it makes me think that there's like this threshold that if you cross over, the athlete stops adapting at all, really.
Yeah, they run out of adaptation currency. That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah. Do you guys think that that's like legit? Do you think that's true? Have you seen it happen?
Absolutely. Yeah. I can't tell you how many times I've taken on like bubble level regional athletes where they'll send me their training volume and I'll look at it and I'm like, holy shit, like they're doing so much work. And I'll even have a conversation with them. I'm like, look, I think you should be doing like 30-40% of what you're doing.
Well, specifically, are you talking like 4 or 5 hours a day? Like, is that like, holy shit?
Yeah, and I'll often tell them, like, they never want to do that because from their mind, that's a hard sell. But I'll usually tell them, like, give me 6 months and just follow exactly what I say. And if you don't get better, I'll program whatever the fuck you want. You could tell me how many hours you want to train per day. You could create your entire training split and skeleton, and I'll just fill in the details for you, and we could make that happen. But inevitably, like the first 2 months, they usually feel pretty flat and like lethargic, and they're like, I just feel like shit.
Why is that?
It's because when they're in the state that they came in on, they have stress hormones circulating all of the time. So they're basically running on fumes.
Right.
And when athletes are in like somewhat overtraining phases, they usually feel fucking great because you have stress hormones going all the time. And that's why sometimes you'll give an athlete a deload week and they'll feel like complete crap during the deload. They're like, I feel so sluggish and like I feel tired and I just want to do more training. If that's happening to the athlete, that means they're probably in a chronically overreaching phase, and it takes a few months to really like self-correct that. But when you do, then athletes get to the point where they could adapt on pretty little work. If you look at an athlete like Noah, for example, where the dude, you could give him like 20 different types of training and he adapts well to everything. Everyone's body has an innate adaptive potential. Obviously, he's an extreme example. Like Kyle said, adaptation currency.
He has
if
a lot.
Noah's like a millionaire in adaptation currency, maybe I have like $55. But that being said, like most people are blowing $55 every day of the week and they're going into debt.
In their AM session of Monday.
Yeah, exactly. So what you could do better, like if you could really pull someone's volume back, get them to the point where their health is optimized, because there's so many underlying things that if you just fix the holes inside their body, not literally, yes, they have like leaky gut, which
that would be something that you could address.
Then you have holes, those could be plugged.
Yeah.
I was just about to say something fucking weird, but I'm not gonna say it.
Evan, I'm gonna piggyback off that a little bit.
I'm gonna fill in the weird shit for you.
Evan, we're gonna switch just a little bit. One thing I think that is important to keep in mind is that when you look at the athletes that have been successful in the past, you might say, man, Froning, he followed this really high volume training program and he had great results. Yes, that's absolutely true. For Rich, that was his method for getting to the top of the sport and winning multiple championships. But if you look, most of the people that follow really high training volumes, really high volume programs, they're not successful in the sport. You have your outliers. You have some that follow really high training volume programs and they're successful. But the vast majority of those people are just, sitting at home watching regionals on the live stream.
Well, they're in the gym training, really.
Yeah.
Or they're in the gym with it. You're right. They're not sitting at home watching the live stream.
They're on the assault bike.
They're on the assault bike watching the live stream. What that shows is that when you have to use a high volume training program in order to elicit adaptation, what you're really doing is you're throwing as much stuff at the wall, as much shit at the wall as possible, and seeing what sticks. And there will be some athletes who have $1 million adaptation currency, like Noah and like Rich and like Matt, who will continue to get better as a result of that. And you will have 100,000 more who don't. And what that shows is that if your program requires you to have really high volumes of training to get people to adapt, then you don't really know what things are making the athlete adapt. Like you're missing out on the most potent components of training. If that's what's required, then it shows a lack of understanding of what you should be doing.
And if you do go too high too soon too, like if you're not adapting to that, where do you go next? Like there is no next logical step, because you're like, well, say I'm doing 100 units of training volume and 50 is their optimal. It's like, well, it leads to the illusion of like, maybe I should do 125 and I'll get better versus like, I'm going to cut down to 50. So I think always starting an athlete with less than you think they need is probably the best way to go, because then you could take the next logical step and add more. But if you're already doing a ton, you've almost like sunk the boat in. You need to like build a new boat entirely to even get where you want to go.
Training volume is a great tool. I want to be clear here. Like, using high volume periods of training is a great tool for getting athletes to adapt. It's great for learning new movements and getting exposure to the vast variety of stuff that you have to deal with in CrossFit. And for a games athlete, like, let's face it, you're gonna have to run and carry sandbags and do all this other, potentially paddleboard and all these different things, right, that you wouldn't normally get exposure to unless you're doing really high volume training. So it is a tool that has to be used, but it's not a tool that needs to be used for everybody to get them from point A, which is 1,000th in the open, to the top 20. In fact, for most people, it won't work.
And I was going to say, for those athletes, wouldn't you just make the argument that high volume approach I mean, at the end of the day, it's all relative, but that's just the right amount of volume for that athlete in that exact scenario. I think where people get into the wrong path in this sport is that people just want to do volume for the sake of doing volume without a purpose. Like, if you look at a sport like running, I personally know sub 4-minute milers that run 40 miles a week, and I know sub 4-minute milers that run 120 miles per week, and they have the exact same times. The 120-mile athlete, or the 40-mile athlete, isn't wishing that they could run 120 miles a week and run the same exact times that they're running. They're like damn happy that they don't need to spend how many hours. But in CrossFit, an athlete could be doing like 5 sessions a week and making good progress. And I've even had like regional level athletes where we've done that, and they like keep getting better, but they want to do more. And when we have them up their sessions, they stop progressing or they do worse. But they're still reticent to go back to 5, even though that's what works for them. Like, they want to do more and be these high-volume athletes, even if that's not what they need. And I think that's just, like, a disconnect in this sport for whatever reason. Is like, people just want to be that guy that trains 20 times a week. Yeah, ego, or, like, maybe...
I think it's just social proof. That's what they've seen that the champions have done. And so they think that in order to, they're trying to reverse engineer what the best have done to themselves, when that's not, they're not the best. They don't have that physiology. They don't have that anatomy. They might have a different cardiac system. They might have a different respiratory system. They have a different physiological limiter. So doing the same thing that someone else did is not going to get you the same result.
Yeah, we had Mike Israel on, but he was on another podcast I was listening to him say that what a lot of people also haven't considered is quite a lot of these athletes who have come from extensive training backgrounds of suffering. Obviously training CrossFit for 30 hours a week is a lot of suffering. It is for them therapy. And if you probably ask them about their past, there's probably some dark shit in there, whether it's to do with, social circles or parents or relationships falling apart and that sort of thing. And, being able to just suffer for 5, 6, 7 hours a day is their therapy, right? And so they're just doing it to just numb their mind and their emotions.
That's what I was talking about at the beginning of the podcast, finding meaning in suffering.
Right.
So this is a suffering that can provide meaning because it has a direction, right? CrossFit itself, well, not CrossFit itself, because a group class tends to be something that's not, I would say it's not suffering because it's enjoyable because it's a social setting, but training for a sport tends to be less enjoyable and more of a suffering experience, especially 30 hours plus a week of training for a sport like CrossFit. It allows them to suffer and have a purpose or meaning to that suffering.
And I was going to say, like, CrossFit, if you look at it as a sport and, like, what kinds of activities you're doing in that training, like, it's an extremely, like, dopaminergic activity.
Yes.
Like, that type of training drives your dopamine levels pretty high, and people get addicted to that shit. So it's like you want to keep doing it despite the fact that all the evidence says you're not going to get better if you keep doing this. And I think you see that in, like, ultra-endurance sports, too. Like, I've worked with a few athletes in that sport, and you look at their background. Some of them were, like, drug addicts or heroin addicts, and after they get off the drugs, they start running 100-plus miles a week, and they're just feeding into the same kind of addiction.
Yeah. Did you really just drop dopaminergic?
I just dropped dopaminergic.
Yeah. There you go.
I've learned like 9 words on this podcast
that you never heard of before.
Never heard of.
I'm just gonna start making up words, dropping them, and you're gonna use it in a podcast in like 2
in the
months.
future. This guy Evan said this. That's 100%. It's the same. I mean, it's the same pathway for like what we're talking about: social media addiction, for checking your phone, for checking notifications, for like having that social anxiety, right? And we've seen people like in their deload weeks, that athletes that we've been surrounded by, you're talking about with the stress hormone and thing as well, but they're also, from the addictive standpoint, not having anything to do creates depression, creates anxiety. They walk around, they're slumped, they're bored, like their whole mood is different, and it's part stress hormone, but I feel like it's also part depression because they're not feeding that addiction.
Their self-concept is completely wrapped up in training. They are, I am an athlete, even if they're not necessarily an athlete by the definition that, we would use to define an athlete.
Sure.
Their training is their self-identity. So if they're on a week where they don't have training or they get injured, right? That's where you see it the worst. They get a back injury that prevents them from basically doing just about anything. Man, the fall from their high of training to the low is it's sometimes hard to watch if it's one of your athletes.
Tragic,
it really is. And I think a lot of that is because people's self-concept is so tied up into it that the only place that they find meaning in their life is through the gym, and everything else that they do, they don't really have anything else outside of that provides them with meaning.
Well, the insidious part too, like if you look at a sport like CrossFit, or even track and field, I know we've talked about this example, is a lot of the best athletes in these sports where you do talk to them, they're like super myopic and they're kind of like psychos in some ways.
Yeah.
That is characteristics of like a dopamine dominant brain state. Like you could take like a neurotransmitter profile test and see what your dominance is. So the same thing that leads some athletes to becoming this supreme winner, like this dominator, is also the thing that could lead them to that downfall, or lead athletes who are like subpar athletes into getting into those same destructive states. I know I think it was in the energy system course, the new variation, we had a section on like health principles that enhance athletic performance, and some of them were based around dopamine levels, like keeping your brain health safe in those ways that actually improve performance.
One of those things was deleting social media apps.
Instant gratification, things of those nature.
Right. Yeah, it's one way I look at it, or I watch certain athletes that I know are much more heavily addicted to the high of training, is also how quickly it wears off after a workout. Mm-hmm. You almost see like, I will...
By the time we're finished, it's already worn off.
Yeah, like I will think, oh wow, that was such a good training session. I feel like I don't have to train for 3 or 4 days. It was so
like,
good.
What's the finisher going to be?
Yeah, and they're up and they're like, it wasn't hard enough. Let's write something else. So they're
going to do an EMOM now.
Yeah. It's like, what's next? Like, keep feeding it over and over and over again.
But one thing to keep in mind is that some people that, like we talked about, the way that they adapt, their adaptation currency is just greater. And there are some people that are going to need to train with greater volume. So if you're a coach and you're listening to this, keep in mind that, while some people it is a form of addiction, some people actually do need more training. I coach athletes who, are regional or even, games team athletes that they adapt really well to 3 sessions a day. 3 sessions that each one of them would be a full training day for me.
Yeah.
Right? Like each session is almost like 3 parts. And that would absolutely destroy me, and they handled that with no problem.
And that's just an individual thing,
5 days a week.
And for them, that's the right amount of volume, though. You're not doing it because they want to train more. You're doing it because you found, like, oh, this is actually what they need to adapt. Like, Travis and Noah aren't there training 5 hours a day because they want to be doing that. At this level in their career, that's just what they need. If they go in and do, like, a session that, like, you might do or I might do. You
can detrain yourself to make it so they could detrain themselves to make it so they could get adaptation out of 1 hour of training. I did that.
But you'd also had like a 20-year training career training like doubles prior to that.
Close to that, but not quite 20.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a different scenario.
That would have been 13. So actually, no, make it 19 years.
Yeah, I say Noah would have been like 7 years old if he was doing that.
Yeah, touche.
Yeah. We got sidetracked for like at least 30 minutes. We were talking about more of the principles of that don't work. Are we still in that? We got more?
Oh, yes. I mean, if we actually look at some of those, I know we had mentioned it already, like supercompensation, a lot of those classical theories, they assume volume and intensity are the only things that influence training adaptation. And the reality is training or any of those inputs really just take place on like a chessboard of like biochemistry and our hormones and everything. And if you really look into those fields, there's something called the biopsychosocial model. Okay. So it's essentially saying everything in our body is an interplay of our biology. So that's our genetics, our hormones, our biochemistry, really like the food we're eating. Psycho, mental state, what's going on in our mind, our social interactions, our relationships, and then social, which feeds into like the environment as well. So that all is like the clusterfuck that determines what happens in training. So you could be doing everything perfect from a volume and intensity standpoint.
Right.
But if you just went through like a breakup or something, or you're going through a rough patch in your life, or even your environment's not that conducive to training, you're just not going to adapt optimally. Maybe you need way more training in that state, or you need less, but ultimately it determines, like, if you look at these classic schemes, like this week you do 5 by 5 at this percent, this week you do it at this percent, you add 5 sets. I think that's really just us trying to create some control and system that looks good on paper, but the reality is that's not how our bodies adapt. Maybe this week you do 5 by 5 at 320 pounds. Next week, if you want to do a progression, maybe your body would be like 4 by 3 at 320, and that's still going to get you the adaptation on paper. That's less volume and intensity, and you'd think that's a regression. But if that's what your body needs at that point, that's what you give it, and that's what you need to adapt. And that's where those auto-regulated strength protocols that we talked about the other day come into play.
Yeah.
It's finding what your body needs on that day and just giving it that, whether or not it's less than 2 weeks ago, because that need for control or things that look pretty on paper, ultimately they don't work as well, and they really don't matter.
So that concept really does inform the way that you should coach, especially if you're working with athletes. Again, people that are performance athletes. It should inform the way that you coach them. In that, we have the bio, right? So we're trying to improve their physiology, change the way that their body is actually structured, whether it's adding muscle tissue or changing tendon structure or building capillary density or changing their cardiac output. Like, that's the biology component.
Right.
But that's going to be influenced by the social. So the environment that they're training in, right? So are they training solo? Are they training with other people? That's going to influence the type of adaptation that they receive. And then the psycho, the mental aspect of it. Are they under stress? How are they putting their training into context? All of those things are rolled together and should inform your training. If you're trying to coach a high-level performer, you need to give them all of those things in doses. You need to give them training that's focused on where they're by themselves and they're just changing the way that their body functions. You need to give them training that's in an environment where it's a competitive environment. They have to deal with the social cues and are they winning? Are they losing? Teaching them to context losses, right? And then helping them develop a self-concept that's bigger than just the sport, because that is one of the things that we see almost always across the board leads people to better adaptation, to more positive adaptation types. So that model should be the basis of your coaching, right? As for high level or performance-based athletes.
So the self-concept thing being that there are other things in your life. It's not just about who you are as an athlete. It's, your partners, your relationships, your career, all that sort of stuff.
Think about how many athletes. I know Michael Phelps has been one of the most vocal after the Olympics, right? He spiraled into a massive state of depression, alcoholism, all that stuff.
The recent Olympics?
Not the most recent.
Oh, okay.
Before. He finally had a self-concept that was bigger than bigger than the sport or bigger than himself. He was competing for something that was bigger. If you look, there are so many. I think Matt Frazier talked about it after the first time that he won the CrossFit Games. When he walked back, there was like, maybe it was when he took runner up, but he walked back into the back and expected something, and there was nothing there. Like, he expected something to happen, and it wasn't there because at that time, and I would say it's probably not the case now, but his self-concept was so wrapped up into competing at that time that when he achieved whatever he was trying to achieve, which that year was a runner-up to Rich Froning, the letdown afterward, there was nothing there. There was no meaning.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked about it with Khan recently, how he said that before, or when he'd qualified before, Khan Porter, Australian Games athlete, what, 4 times now?
Yeah, 4.
Yeah, he, for the first time going into competing, for him, it's like, it's not a selfish process anymore. It's about, what did he say it was about? It's about like influencing and showing other people that have like mental health issues that they can, train and be an example that, you can overcome these things and work hard and be a good example for like, your life can be, you're not going to lose your life to your mental health. Yeah.
Yes.
And you can, train, and he's going to set a good example for that. And he's like, whether I win or lose now, it's not really about that. It's about showing people that you can, put your mind to something and dedicate yourself towards something and achieve big things. It doesn't have to be CrossFit. For him it is, and that's what people see, but it can be anything.
When people are so wrapped up in the idea that they're an athlete and that their performance is what defines them, they become almost like hyper intensive on that. Like their only thought process is, I have to do this. And I feel like that's one of the things that actually leads people to fail, like get right up to where they want to go and then fall short.
I've seen that as well.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is. It's just I
think that there's a term in psychotherapy. They call it hyperintention, and I think they originally saw it in people who had erectile dysfunction. They would put so much pressure on themselves to perform, and their whole self-concept was wrapped up in performing for a woman, and then when it came time to do it, they couldn't.
Yeah.
And through psychotherapy, as soon as they got people to stop thinking about it constantly, obsessively, it all worked naturally. So when people are so wrapped up in the idea that they have to, I have to go to regionals, I have to qualify for the games, as soon as they can get some distance from that and realize that their entire life is not wrapped up in that and reduce some of that hyperintention, then if they've done the training and they've done all the things that they needed to throughout the year, then it almost just happens for them.
Well, the problem is that because they believe it all year round, by the time it gets to that, it is their whole life.
Yep.
They put their career aside, they put relationships aside, they put all those things aside, so they don't set themselves up for when it's not there. And there's nothing for them to turn back on when they're like, all right, well, maybe it's not everything. What else have I got? Nothing. That's when it's upsetting. All right, we'll get back to these principles. Okay, you said the main model.
So
what would be, have you got other stuff on why it doesn't work, or have you got new things?
So this ties into why it doesn't work and why we think there's a better model. But traditionally, when people look at training adaptation, let's say it's like a linear A to B. They're right here, and point B is over here, and there's 100 doors in front of them. And they do a training input, and they open a door, they get to another, and they keep stepping one step forward until they get there. In reality, that's not how adaptation works.
Yeah.
What adaptation really does, instead imagine someone standing in the middle of a giant circle and around them there's like hundreds of doors that they have an option to open. Behind one of those doors is the training outcome that they want.
Okay.
So we're not pushing them towards that training outcome. What we're doing when we give them proper training principles and control all of these lifestyle variables is we're taking away other options.
Right.
So we could call those other doors like the degrees of freedom. These are all the things that their physiology could self-organize into. So let's say we give them like really good training. We're trying to get them stronger. Mm-hmm. And out of those 100 doors, we knock out 50. Those aren't options anymore. They have 50 left. Now they're sleeping, they're eating properly, we'll knock out another 20 doors. So now there's, I can't even do math.
30 doors.
There's 30 doors left. I was like, I don't remember how much I said in the other one. So same principles. Now like their social structure is good. They're in a good training environment. They're getting vitamin D. They have healthy mitochondria and all these things. And let's say we have 2 doors right now. One of them is that strength training goal that they want. The other one makes them better equipped to handle chronic stress. This athlete is always stressed. They're like dealing with extraneous bullshit from work. Well, why would their physiology self-organize and open that door that makes them stronger? That doesn't make them suited for the environment. Right. They open that other door and go to that. So what you're doing when you're controlling all of these training inputs, you're not actually pushing yourself towards one of these options. You're just limiting your other options and making it more likely that that will happen. At the end of the day, our physiology doesn't give a fuck if we could lift a heavier barbell or if we could win the CrossFit Games. What our bodies care about is that we're suited for our environment.
Right.
If you're training every day and that's a big part of your life, training becomes part of your environment. Your brain doesn't know that that doesn't matter. So that is something important that our body wants to adapt to make us better suited to survive, so to speak. But there's all these other inputs throughout the day too. You have like 20 hours that you're not training.
Depending on who you are, of course.
Depending on who you are. So if you could control all of those other variables and make it so that training is your primary environmental stressor, not some bullshit that you're thinking about from work all day and stressing about, you're going to make it so much more likely that that's the outcome you get, because that's ultimately how adaptation works. It's not a linear process. If you look at the science of it, it's called dynamic systems theory. And what it basically says is there's no set pattern of adaptation. There's not this like golden egg that you're chasing and trying to get. Everything in the way that your body adapts in every way, it's really just random self-organization. And there's millions of degrees of freedom that random process could self-organize into. So you just want to limit them as much as you can if you're trying to get a specific goal.
I think of it like a river. Right?
Okay.
The delta of a river, right? So if you guys
What's the delta of a river?
So it's when it like right before it meets the ocean. You see it kind of like spider webs almost.
Okay.
Right? And so the concept of self-organization to me is almost like there's certain at some point the possibilities of that river are to go in all directions. But what happens is you put dams in front of certain parts of that river and you prevent it from going in that direction.
Yeah.
That's like the most simple way to think about it.
You literally just took my exact door analogy from when you were outside the room and just replaced the word door with river.
Damn it.
So what is the
I like river more because it's adaptable and flowing.
I like the door because most people don't know it. He didn't even know what a river delta was. No one knows what that is.
It's like the Nile River.
That's like the Nile River Delta, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
No, the door, you have to choose to go through one of them. So
Saying the
therefore,
river
Well, I was
just
saying
happens.
instead of choosing which door you open, you just knock out other doors and make it so those aren't options.
All right, touche.
So,
We're killing the listeners right now.
Yeah.
Damn it, Kyle.
analogy. I was gonna say analogy game strong.
Yeah. So that's with the training stuff. Without going for another hour on this stuff, how can you apply this sort of this new adaptation theories and knowledge and understanding to what you put in your body as nutrition? If things aren't necessarily linear and how you're adapting, does that mean it's not as important to put, block periodization in terms of, how you scale up your macronutrients or your eating?
So what Evan was just talking about is you want to control all the variables outside of your training so that training becomes the primary stress that your body's adapting to.
Mm-hmm.
What that means is that preventing under fueling or ensuring that you have, we'll just say it this way, ensuring that you have adequate fueling for the stress that you're applying with your training is the key to getting adaptations out of your training.
Right.
So to say that nutrition wouldn't matter, nutrition is one of those variables that you do have to control. Right. But I don't know if it necessarily needs to be controlled for an athlete to the degree that some people believe that it does. Like the idea that you have to hit this certain number of
every day
macros every day, like that's an easy way to make sure that you're safe and that you're controlling that variable.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have, like, to think that as an athlete that you have to get exactly 450 grams of carbohydrates and exactly 200. I mean, that's to assume that the labels on the packages and the app that you're using are all accurate in the first place, which they're not.
And that the soil that you got the fucking food from is the same too. Like, that varies so widely. And I think that circles back to our needing control, which ultimately, like, if you really want to dial these things in, you need to relinquish that, because stressing about that shit, like, I've literally seen athletes when we'd have them come on site, we're like, I have 8 grams of carbs left for the day and I need to hit that. I'm going to have 14 grains of rice because I need to get those 8 grabs, because if I underfuel on my macros, I'm going to be hypoglycemic tomorrow. And I'm like, what the fuck are you
14
talking
grains
about?
of rice.
That's one of the problems where just a little bit of knowledge is so fucking dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, 14 grains of rice. That's so good.
How many grams of carbohydrates is 14 grams of rice?
Couldn't tell you, so I'm not tracking to that detail.
Wouldn't it depend on the soil? No.
Yeah, it seems like with the nutrition stuff that ultimately it's like a go by feel sort of process. Once you have established or what it would be like to be very accurate. It's like, okay, if I was to like do this perfectly and say you do that for 1 or 2 days just to know what it's like, I need to be like in the ballpark of this thing and then adjust as the environment.
Well, yeah. And I think as you're starting to look at more research, like, I do think having some general range that you want to fall on a given day, probably a beneficial thing. But within that, like, let your body dictate what it needs. If you need more carbs today, go for that. If you need more fat, go for that. If you need less or more calories. I think as time is going on, we're actually seeing that a lot of those strict adherence things probably have negative health benefits long term, like the need to have X amounts of like cyclic dextrin post-workout and shit like that. It's like, well, now that we know how the gut microbiome works, you might actually just be doing yourself a disservice by even consuming that period. And by overfeeding yourself to hit these macro numbers, well, what if you're creating like dysbiosis or like infections in your gut, and that's going to make it so you have less adaptation currency. So I think having those general ranges so you are creating some control and creating less variables, but within that, like, not being myopic or adherent to something just because it looks good on paper. And I think ultimately, like, you could apply that concept to anything within the training sphere.
Yeah, I always know a bad sign with any athlete is when you see them do a certain amount of training, what are you doing? They go, oh, it's written down, it has to be done. I go, that is a recipe for disaster. Like, you need to fix that attitude immediately.
I'm sure that anyone that is training, though, that is training to be an athlete, has gone through that at some point in their life.
Of course.
I know that I fell into that trap. It's on the paper, so it needs to be done.
Yeah.
It's like you have this assigned amount of work to you, and you have to do it. But that's part of the reason that the auto-regulation protocols work so damn well.
And like what you're saying is part of the like ridiculousness of like people being so adherent. Like I come from like the track and field world, and if you even look at how every coach in the sport prescribes, they have like specific numbers of sets that they'll use. Like I've seen people do like 6 sets, 8 sets, 10 sets. I've never seen someone do 9 sets of repeats or like 7. Because it doesn't look good on paper.
Yeah.
So it's like we could convince ourselves like this is like 6 sets, that's a really good training prescription, and 8 sets is really good, but like 7 sets doesn't make sense to give someone. And it's like,
so neurotic.
Yeah, it's like, what are you talking about? But if you do auto-regulated, like you might do 13 sets of back squats, or you might do like 4, or you might do 7.
But then what happens is you draw out the athlete's cognitive bias, right?
Yeah,
so
they always finish
on like a 10 or a 12 or a 14, right? So it's like you tell them to do as many sets of back squats at 85%, rest 60 seconds. As many sets of 3 at 85%, rest 60 seconds between each one, right? And every time you get their feedback, it's like, I did 6 on week 1, on week 2, they did 10, on week 3, they did 12. So they're always ending. You're seeing their cognitive bias come out instead of your own, but at least they're listening to their body to some degree versus you as a coach trying to predict how many sets they will need in order to adapt, which, as I said earlier, is extremely egotistical.
Yeah, when I do it, it's more just me thinking to myself, how it feels around 2 or 3, one first set, second set, sometimes you're not quite warmed up properly or you just haven't kind of switched on yet. Usually around 3rd, 4th set, you've hit your groove, and I'm like, when it deviates too much from how this feels, I'm done.
That is a great way to do it.
Yeah, and then I just go off that, and I try not to think what set am I up to. Yeah, it's more like, when am I kind of over this?
Lachlan, that is the correct way to approach it. You've done it.
5 sets every time. Yeah, no, it's been much better, I find, and especially when you've got like a pretty hectic schedule, like Raph and I have. That's pretty, we don't always have 2 hours in the middle of the day to train, like we like to think we do, but different meetings and stuff get in the way. Sometimes you come to a training session and you're just so burnt out from the day, or you're just so time poor that when there's not. You don't feel bad if you don't hit the 10 sets. When it's 4 to 15 or whatever it is, you could do 4 because just mentally you can't take doing more than 4, So I think even that, people just think, oh, well, I should do 10, They don't have to do 10.
So we have not just created auto-regulated strength training protocols, but we've also created auto-regulated energy system training protocols and auto-regulated Metcon or like sport-specific protocols for our sport,
I'd
for
take
CrossFit.
it farther, and I'd say, like, we didn't even just make these up. Like, they're actually tied to physiology. When I was training for the 500-meter row, like a year and a half ago.
What'd you get?
I think I did like a 120.8.
Oh,
I was
like
at 107 pounds body weight.
That is crazy.
I was like 0.7 seconds away from the world record in my weight class, and I found that out like 3 weeks later.
Had you known,
really good.
Had I known, I probably wouldn't have hit it.
Yeah,
anyway.
I was gonna say you would have had hyperintention and fallen just short.
I literally created like an autoimmune issue from the training that I did for that. I'm not even kidding either, but
well,
don't do what I did. But leading up to that, months prior, I had popped on the Moxie monitor. Instead of doing the auto-regulation by feel, which this is initially how we created it, I did auto-regulation based on when does my physiology hit a breaking point. So on a given week, I did the exact same workout every single week for a little over 6 months just to see what would happen. On a given week, I'd go 4 sets, 28 sets, 11 sets, 39, 60 sets, 15. 0 trend whatsoever.
Right.
It based entirely off of what I did in the days prior, how I was feeling. And on paper, it fucking drove me crazy because I would look at my training log and it made no sense whatsoever. And I auto-regulated almost every training input that I did. And that's one of the things that led to me hitting that really good row time, was just letting my body hit right below its ceiling on every session, even though it made no sense on paper. But there was a structure to it. The workouts progressed at some level, but the amount of sets, how long I'd go on each interval, were all just determined on what I wanted my physiology to accomplish. Then with that, finding trends like, oh, when I hit this ceiling, this is what I'm feeling inside my body, and doing it with other people. that's how we created those auto-regulated protocols. They weren't just things that we like pulled out of our ass, like, oh, this is cool.
Right, but you set the monitor to like a certain number, and as soon as it hit that number, you were like,
no,
I'm not.
I was consciously monitoring. I had on my laptop,
Right.
I would do my salt bike intervals, and I would literally like, we have these little desks that you could hook up to the squat rig.
Yeah.
And I'd have my laptop like 3 feet in front of me while I'm on the rower or the bike, and I'd be monitoring between sets how much blood volume I have in the muscle and how much oxygen saturation I have in the muscle.
Yeah.
So I would be consciously looking at it during my rest periods, and I would see when there would be like what I'd call like a physiological breaking point. I'd see like, oh, my respiratory system stopped reloading oxygen into my blood here, or my blood pressure can't regulate properly, or my mitochondria can't suck in oxygen anymore.
And then,
that constitutes like I'm right at the edge of a breaking point, and then I would just stop there for the day. And some days that would be 4 sets, some days it would be over 30.
We rebuilt our entire energy system course and our entire strength. I would say our entire energy system training model and our entire strength training model based on the research that Evan did there, because what we found was that what he was discovering with the Moxie explained the things that we were seeing in training and the things that we were seeing in different types of athletes and the way that they respond to different types of training, whether it was endurance training, strength training, mixed work. We found that explained it much better than the old models. And that is why we started creating new models and new courses to explain those models to people.
It feels like just even the longevity of an athlete would be like that's taken into consideration a lot more now.
We think so. We don't know yet because, I mean, these models are 1.5 years old.
Yeah, but from what we've seen, like I know for myself in the past, coming from that endurance background, I was always like the most extreme hard gainer with strength work, and I would do so much fucking volume, and it usually wouldn't. It would pay off for short periods, and I'd inevitably get injured because I would keep pushing past the point where, say I was doing 10 sets of 3 on back squat at 90%, I'd get through like 7 sets and I'd just like force the next 3 out. With these auto-regulated protocols where you're never pushing past that point of compensation, it allows you to do that week in and week out for weeks on end without ever getting to that breaking point of your body. And I think there is something to those principles. And again, we haven't been doing these for 5 to 10 years to see how it plays out.
I will also say I have not been able to successfully use them to peak a strength athlete for a strength test, if that makes sense.
Would I be the first one then?
No, I would not consider you a strength athlete.
Oh, okay.
What I'm talking about are people that are already very, like, mid 500 plus deadlift. I just haven't gotten all the way there yet.
I have used them on those athletes, and I have used them on some of my weightlifting athletes, and the way that I do peak them is a good bulk of their training is auto-regulated. But then within like anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks from when I want to peak them, that's when I switch from an auto-regulated approach to a mixture of like structure that would potentially look good on paper and like variable just based on how they're feeling. So instead of them auto-regulating the training, I kind of do the auto-regulating for them, but with peaking strength protocols and things that like everyone already knows, pretty classic protocols that you'd use to peak an athlete, and just shifting the focus from auto-regulation to that. And I found that to actually work pretty well. Same thing with energy system testing. Say we want them to hit the goal in 10 weeks. The first 7 will probably be pretty heavy auto-regulated, and then I'll take the reins and start to adjust their peaking for that.
Yeah, I was going to say it could remove the need a little bit more for deloading and peaking, like very specific deloading and peaking.
Yeah.
Which is cool. It's cool because it makes more sense to me, right? It's like you're going into a competition and there's so much changes from 1 week out of the open versus 30 weeks out of the open, like the mental state.
Absolutely.
Like they just sit there and their palms are just sweaty all day long, and they normally have dry palms because they're just thinking about it constantly, right? So yeah, there's so many factors at play. I think we'll stretch this too long, but unless you wanted to add any final things to your new models, I will ask Kyle the final 4 questions for the 4th time.
To be honest, I think we've barely even scratched the surface on the new models. But
we just kind of talk shit on the old model.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's enough for listeners, but we can always go again. The final 4 questions, Kyle. Again, 4th time. You've actually we were talking about this morning. You are the most popular My Muscle Project guest of all time. You've done the most episodes ever. You've overtaken Brent Fikowski.
You make me feel good.
Yeah. So it's Kyle, my coach, then Brent Fikowski, and then Third person was
It's got to be Max. He's done 2.
I think when Max does his third one, it will be Max. Yeah.
Hopefully.
That's the podium.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good podium.
I'll take a top spot. At least I can win something, right?
Oh no, wait, Khan's done 3.
Yeah, constantly.
Khan's done 3.
Don't do another one with him so I can stay up there.
If we do a 2-parter with Max though, that'd be a lot. All right, Carl. So first question is the interview question. Who would you sit down and interview today if you could sit down and speak to them about anything and they'd answer openly and honestly?
Living or
Living.
Living. All right. I think based on what I've read most recently, this is just temporal, not like I don't think I have anybody that's like this person that I'm like, oh man, I wish I could interview. But either Michael Pollan,
Yes.
author, or the guy who wrote, and now I just had his name and it just slipped out of The Obstacle's the Way.
Oh, Ryan Holiday.
One of those two guys, just because those are the things that I've read most recently, and that I've read and were influential most recently.
What have you read from Michael Pollan?
I read his most recent book,
How to Change Your Mind?
How to Change Your Mind.
What did you think about that?
That was a very interesting book. It definitely opened my eyes to a whole set of things that I was not even aware of.
That is
Did you
an
read it as well?
understatement as to oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably one of the most, I think in 25, 30 years, people will look back at this book as something that, and all the media that he's doing around the book, like the podcast,
Yep.
Joe Rogan, Tim Ferriss, etc., as one of like the most influential shifts in like the culture of.
I hope that you are right.
Yeah.
And I hope that, everything that's discussed in the book, and I hope the research pans out and that it's not a flash in the pan. I hope that we now have solutions for mental health problems that we haven't had in the past. I hope that is something that pans out because let's face it, that depression, alcoholism, opiate addiction, anxiety, those are massive world problems that are way bigger than what we do in, coaching CrossFitters. And it's fun, but those are massive world problems. And I would love to see there be solutions for those people that are that are not within as he described it. I wouldn't describe it because I have no experience with the mental health system, but with our current broken mental health system.
There are no solutions that work to the extent like, and he's talked about this in the book, like, cancer treatment, right? Like chemotherapy, like massive evolutions there.
I think back to my sister when she passed away in 2015 from cancer. And I think about just her last few weeks and how much that could have potentially been changed had she had access to the experiences that Michael talks about in the book. It would have been just a completely different experience for everyone involved in my family, not just for her, I think.
Yeah, I would absolutely love to sit down and interview Michael Pollan.
Get him on the podcast.
That would be amazing, yeah. Did we try and reach out to him? Was it him or? No, we tried to reach out to Matthew Walker, the sleep guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's who we tried to reach out to.
It might happen. He's on a tour.
Well, maybe now that I have mentioned him on this podcast, but I'm sure there's so many people that are on podcasts right now that are like, man, I read this book and it was really influential for me. Maybe now that I mentioned it and you guys, throw it in there, that maybe you guys can get him on there. Who knows?
Who else Chris, was it you that just read the book, Michael Pollan's book? Were we talking about it?
Yeah, and Max as well.
Yeah. And
I
Max?
feel like everyone's
I think it's
reading
required.
that right now.
It's here. I think it's required reading for our training think tank.
Yeah.
Oddly, one was shipped here to me anonymously.
Michael Pollan's book?
Yes, it arrived. This was the strangest thing. Evan and I and Brandon and Mike
we were talking about it earlier that day too. Kyle pulled out his phone. He's like, "Oh, check out this book that I got on Kindle," and then it showed up in the mail. No one knows where it came from.
I didn't order
Amazon.
it.
Amazon buys you shit you don't even order now, right?
Oh well, if that's the case,
It
thank
just
you.
automatically
Amazon.
buys you stuff.
Wait, what do you mean?
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, it's like artificial intelligence. It knows what you're gonna want.
No, it's not in my list. Not in my
But
list.
also, Amazon's not going to make you pay for shit if you don't.
Yeah, we'll do. That's
No
why it's
way.
the biggest company now.
No, what are you talking about?
Amazon Prime Plus.
I was going to say, and Amazon's working through Whole
just
Foods.
buys
I
you
wake
shit.
up checking out food that I'm like,
Evan, turn up your skepticism a little bit right now.
Man.
That book had application for from a coaching perspective, not taking not having athletes take psychedelics or anything like that, but just
Tried it, didn't work.
yeah, it didn't help. Just the idea that one of the things that can help people the most is getting them to, number one, get out of grooves of thinking that they're stuck in. Number two, expanding their self-concept beyond just themselves. Number 3, and I think this is the most important one, facing their fucking fears in training all the time. It was something I was already like going towards as a coach and as an athlete myself, but just getting people to be more honest about the movements and workouts and the pain. What are you afraid of in the sport? Pain? Well, guess what? This is a pain sport. So you're going to have to learn to fucking love that. Right? So I think those are my big 3 takeaways. Reading that book through a coach's and training lens, those are my big takeaways. And then there's all the stuff, like I said, with my sister and, people that in my family that have dealt with alcoholism and things like that. I just think it would be such an amazing tool if everything pans out.
I absolutely think it will. I think there's already forces at play, and there's so much money. I think I'm not sure. Didn't read the entire book. I read 80% of it, but
okay. You should finish the book. The last couple chapters are.
Did he talk about the funding of the guys that are doing the MDMA research with how they're being funded? Did he talk MAPS?
MAPS. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you knew how MAPS is being funded, but they're being funded by Bitcoin entrepreneurs. Which is essentially untraceable, uncorruptible levels of cash, like billions of dollars of money and funding that they can use.
I did recently read that Bitcoin itself is there's strong evidence that it's being manipulated.
Yeah, no, that's why the market's crashing. Yeah, but I think regardless, it means that the ways these things are being funded are not being corrupted. Which is really interesting. Yeah. Okay. Second question. What is is there a new routine that you've introduced this year you feel like is successful to every single day, or required for the success of the day?
Yeah, I actually wake up way earlier than I have in the past. So I used to, and a lot of this was when my daughter was in school. I would sleep until I had to get up to help her get ready for school. Right. Just recently, I've started waking up about an hour and a half earlier than I was traditionally, and I'm getting so much more done in that span of time. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that I was a morning person, that I woke up for swim practice at 5 a.m. from the time I was 14 until the time I was like 24. And I was so productive during that span of time, and I've just started doing that again. Maybe it was like I had a conversation with Max, and he was talking about waking up earlier. I'm not exactly sure why, but I use some of the sleep principles from that I think you talked about it, but like moving it back 15 minutes, every couple days, and just got myself waking up quite a bit earlier. And I do it consistently, almost pretty much every day, and get a lot more done.
So what are you up to now?
What do you mean?
What time are you waking up now?
I get up at 5 on the dot. Where before I was getting up at like 6:40. I would stretch it to 6:40 if I could, like 6:45. Try to get to 7.
Did you use an alarm, or do you use a light alarm, or are you just naturally waking up now?
I used an alarm to start, and now I wake up naturally at 5 pretty much every single day. Today actually was a struggle to wake up.
Okay.
I was excited about doing the podcast today, or last night.
Okay.
So I got to bed a little bit later, and you know how it works.
Well, you've done a great job so far. So
Evan has done a fantastic job.
Evan's a beast. Evan's first podcast was awesome. We actually, what's crazy? Raph made a joke. He goes, I think Evan's more popular than Travis, because we posted about it going out. And I checked the inbox of messages, because people would just say, looking forward to the podcast, blah, blah, blah. It's 4 more than Travis. So he's up 4 more comments or 4 more messages than Travis Mao.
Travis is copying it. He missed the games and now he's losing to Evan in podcast popularity.
You got to watch out. Evan, we did call him the brain when he got here for at least a year. He's got a lot of knowledge.
Now you're the chosen one? Isn't that the new name?
The chosen one.
So it's not the nickname Max gave me when I moved down here.
No.
And then we got Travis Mayer as Trevor the Feather. That's the new
one.
Feather?
Yeah.
I like that.
Feather for short.
I like that a lot.
Yeah. Okay, so has there been... Well, I guess we've talked about this whole time. Yeah, well, the question is there anything recently you've changed your mind on that was a belief of yours? I feel like we covered... That was the entire podcast.
I talked to you guys about that, about this change in belief the last time I was on the podcast, just that I've completely shifted the way that I think about training. I would say that the biggest change has been taking a more athlete-centric approach to coaching people. And now, instead of just saying like, hey, I want to take a more athlete-centric approach, I have ways to actually go about doing that. I have systems for doing that. I'm not going to talk about the details of that yet, because at some point I think we will probably put that into some sort of educational material. But using the athlete to drive the content of their training, and me just being kind of like, I'm not even like the captain of the ship. I'm like maybe the crew that adjusts the sails or something like that.
Yeah.
I have all the tools. I have the tools in the toolbox. They tell me where they want to go and what tools they need, and I just give them the tools. It's a very different approach than I've taken in the past.
Right.
Where I'm less important in the process.
Do you think that gives you less attachment as well, or allows you to be less emotional in the process?
No, I think it actually gives me more because I understand my athletes better. I know my athletes better. I'm more invested in their success because I identify more with them.
Okay. That's interesting. And then leaving the listeners with a quote and a book.
Well, the book is obvious. It's Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. A quote, man, I'm so terrible with these. I have like a whole, where's my phone? I got like a whole thing of quotes that I've pulled out of there. Now, I don't know if I necessarily have a quote, but I also recently read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and I extracted a lot of quotes. And basically, just the one that stands out to me, and it's not actually a full quote, but just remember that your meaning at any given time changes. And your meaning in 1 minute is different than another. And essentially, our only task is to deal with the set of circumstances that were given directly in front of us. And if you just do that on a daily basis, you're going to be in a much better place. And so if I can give 3 book recommendations, first would be Michael Pollan's book. Second would be The Obstacle is the Way. And the third would be Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
Nice.
Read all of them.
Nice. Did you want to chuck any books in there for us, Evan?
Evan will have good strange books for us.
He already threw some books in his podcast, but unless you...
I actually, I had some time to think about these questions since our last podcast, because I'm like, I feel like I was fucking scrambling, making up
Man, you did good.
shit.
We gave you 10 minutes notice.
But, man, books. One that I like a lot is called Waking Up by Sam Harris. And it kind of goes along what Kyle's saying, kind of starting to see yourself from an outside perspective. I remember one of the things in the book, it's talking about consciousness. And it's saying, like, oh, you walk in a room and you see the coffee cup and you think to yourself, like, oh, the coffee cup's there, like, my jacket's there. And then you realize you're like, who am I talking to right now? Like, if your thoughts could be projected outside of your head, everyone would think you're schizophrenic. So that book just raised a lot of really interesting questions on perspective to me, or starting to understand that, like, if I was born in Kyle's home and had his similar genetics, I'd probably grow up to be exactly like Kyle. So when you don't agree with someone or you dislike someone, it's like, well, that would have been you had you been in those circumstances. So I think books along those lines were things that I tend to resonate more with, or things a little bit more along like philosophical lines.
Yeah, awesome. Sam Harris, he's got a podcast as well, right?
Yeah, and he actually just did an interview with Michael Pollan.
Did he?
Yeah, it was a very interesting one.
I don't think it was as good as the Joe Rogan one.
No, it was not, but it was very interesting.
It's not Joe.
Yeah.
Sam's really into meditation, and I think you can pick that up from his podcast. He relates everything back to his meditation practice.
But I think he had more experience than Joe, or he came at it with like a lot more. He had like more experience than Michael Pollan.
Yes.
With the stuff, so it was pretty interesting.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, gentlemen, thanks for the 2 hours. It was fantastic. And
I can't believe that was 2 hours.
Yeah. Thanks for everyone else for listening, and we'll talk about more details of what we're going to be doing with Training Think Tank over the next year in Max's podcast.
Cool.
All right. Thanks guys.